The only 10 watches with 0 complaints you need to see. What don't you like about your watch? Most watches give you something to complain about. It could be too thick, too heavy, power reserve isn't enough, or the price just doesn't match what you're getting. There's always something wrong. But not always. Every once in a while, a watch comes out that stands out not by being perfect, but by getting the important things so right that people stop complaining altogether. And that's rare. In this video, we're looking at 10 watches that have earned that reputation. These watches have different price points and different philosophies, but they all share one thing in common. People who own them don't have much to say against them. Let's get into it. 10. Nomos Tangent Neomatic 39. The original complaint about Nomos wasn't about design. Nobody argued with the design. The Tangente has been winning awards since 1992 for the same reason it wins them now. It is pure Bauhaus discipline applied to a wrist-worn object. Straight lugs, barely. They're bezel and Arabic numerals that look like they were drawn by someone who'd never heard the word decorative. It's one of the most instantly recognizable watches in the world, and one of the least flashy ways to wear that distinction. The problem was the movement. Entry-level Nomos ran hand-wound calibers. Beautiful to look at through the sapphire caseback. 3/4 plate, glashute ribbing, blued screws, the whole ceremony. But manual wind, in a time when every serious alternative at this price point had auto-winding. And the case sizes felt small to buyers who'd grown up on 40mm as the default. Nomos knew it. They spent years solving it. The DUW 3001 is their answer, and it's an engineering statement as much as a commercial one. At 3.2mm height, this is among the thinnest automatic movements made anywhere on Earth. To achieve that, Nomos compressed component tolerances by up to 50% compared to standard manufacture practice. The rotor stops winding once the mainspring is fully charged, reducing wear and unnecessary energy transfer. Energy efficiency sits at 94.2% compared to a typical automatic's 80%. The Nomos swing system uses a proprietary in-house escapement that replaced the traditional lever and pallet architecture. This is not a movement purchased from a supplier and badged. This was designed in glashute, made in glashute, and it earned independent watchmaking credibility that Nomos spent a decade building toward. At 39mm, the Tangente Neomatic holds the Bauhaus geometry but wears for a modern wrist, 7mm thick. The kind of profile that disappears under a shirt cuff without trying. The one complaint that remains is the gap between the lugs and a strap. The straight lug shape means there's visible space on thick straps. Cosmetic. Everything functional. Addressed. There is a specific buyer the Tangente Neomatic 39 was made for. They work in a design-adjacent field. They know who Dieter Rams is. They think most watches are too much. The DUW 3001 is the movement that finally let them buy the watch they always wanted without a concession they couldn't live with. Nomos took a watch people admired, but hesitated to buy and turned it into one people admire and actually own. So that's clean German design done properly. What's next is precision of a different kind. Japanese, obsessive, and aimed at solving a problem most people didn't know existed. 9 Bulova Lunar Pilot, 43.5mm. The story starts on the moon. In August 1971, Commander David Scott of Apollo 15 had a problem. His Omega Speedmaster, the official NASA chronograph, had failed. So he reached into his kit, pulled out his personal Bulova chronograph, and used it to time a geological experiment on the lunar surface. The watch worked. NASA found out later and they weren't pleased. Bulova eventually reissued the Lunar Pilot as a limited commemorative piece. The original reissue was 45mm. The complaints were immediate and universal. You could land a small aircraft on it. It wasn't wearable. It was a museum piece that happened to have a movement inside. The proportions bore no relationship to how people actually wear watches. The 43.5mm version corrected this. It removed the date window, restoring the clean face of the 1971 original. It pulled the lugs in, and it kept the one thing that makes this watch genuinely extraordinary, the 262 kHz high-performance quartz movement. Most quartz watches run at 32,768 Hz. The Bulova movement vibrates at 262,144 Hz. That's 8 times faster, which exponentially reduces the effect of positional errors and mechanical interference on timekeeping. The result: accuracy of plus or minus 5 seconds per year. The Grand Seiko 9F, which is the industry benchmark for premium quartz, offers 10 seconds per year. The Bulova beats it. At under $600, you are wearing the most accurate moonwatch in existence. More accurate than the Omega Speedmaster moonwatch. More accurate than every mechanical Swiss chronograph on the market, on a case that now actually fits a human wrist. The remaining complaint is that it's quartz in a category where buyers want a heartbeat they can feel. Fair. But the spec is undeniable. Apollo 15 didn't care about movement prestige, it cared about performance. Neither does this watch. So we've talked about a watch with lunar credentials at a terrestrial price. Up next is something that costs more, demands more, and earns every cent. Up next is a German dive watch that literally cannot be scratched. 8 Sin U1 Tegemented. The complaint about luxury tool watches has always been the same one. You spend $3, $5, $8,000 on a serious diver. First week on the desk at work, the bezel picks up a hairline from the edge of your laptop. The case takes a graze from a door handle. The watch looks lived in before you've done anything interesting with it. Shin understood this complaint before most buyers could articulate it. The U1 is made from German submarine steel. This is literally the same alloy specification used in the hull construction of German Navy submarines. It's not a marketing description. There's an abbreviation stamped between the lugs, SUG, for the company that machines the cases from that exact steel. The alloy is inherently more resistant to corrosion than standard 316L and naturally amagnetic because salt water doesn't care what your watch cost, and neither does a magnet. Then Shin takes it further with Tegement technology. This is a proprietary surface hardening process that penetrates approximately 30 microns into the steel itself, creating a surface layer with a hardness of 1,200 Vickers. Standard steel sits at around 200. Shark teeth measure 500. The Tegemented U1 is harder than a shark's tooth and will survive virtually anything you can accidentally do to it at a desk, in a workshop, or on a dive. Water resistance is 1,000 meters. No helium escape valve needed because the watch is rated for low-pressure saturation diving environments that make the HEV redundant. The movement is a Sellita SW200. This is where people sometimes pause. Not in-house. True. But Shin's argument is coherent. They spend their engineering budget on the case technologies, on the materials, on the things that make the U1 functionally different from everything else in its category. The movement is reliable, proven, and readily serviceable anywhere in the world. The aesthetic is Teutonic utilitarian, syringe hands, block markers, nothing that isn't earning its position. Some people find this beautiful. Some people find it blunt. Nobody finds it wrong for what it is. The desk diving scratch problem. Eliminated. Picture the person who buys this watch. They're not performing with it. They're using it. It goes to the job site. It goes in the sea. It comes back looking exactly like it did when it left. After a year of ownership, there is no anxiety ledger building up around it. No mental note to be careful with the desk edge. No quiet calculation about resale condition. The U1 releases you from that tax. That's what $3,000 buys here. Not prestige, but freedom from worry. The U1 is the watch that people who actually use their watches buy when they want to stop worrying about the watch. We've handled the tool case. Number 7 moves to a completely different world. One of the most refined dress watches currently being made anywhere. 7 Grand Seiko SBGW 231. Grand Seiko makes extraordinary spring drive watches. The gliding second hand, the dials that look like seasons in Japan. The finishing that has won over collectors who arrived at Grand Seiko as skeptics and never left. That side of the catalog is well documented. The complaint is that spring drive dials often carry a power reserve indicator on the face. This is functional. The spring drive mechanism benefits from the wearer knowing when a charge is needed. But on a dress watch, that extra complication on the dial creates visual noise. For buyers who want a simple, time-only statement, the power reserve indicator is the one thing sitting between them and what they actually want. The SBGW 231 removes it entirely. No spring drive. No power reserve indicator, no date, no GMT hand, nothing but hours, minutes, and a small second subdial, all sitting inside a 37mm case, 11.6mm thick, executed in the Grand Seiko design grammar that Taro Tanaka codified in 1962. This is a manual wind watch. You wind it every day. This is not a compromise, it's a choice. Manual wind movements allow for thinner calibers, simpler architecture, and in the case of the 9S63 inside this watch, a level of finishing that rewards inspection under a loupe. The movement is adjusted in 6 positions. The accuracy is -3 to +5 seconds per day. The 3/4 plates are rhodium plated. Côtes de Genève, except executed in the glashute ribbing style that Seiko's own tradition has developed independently of Swiss influence. The Zaratsu polished case catches and releases light with the specificity of a cut diamond. Grand Seiko has described the ideal as a surface so precise it appears to generate light rather than reflect it. On the SBGW231 at 37mm, the effect is intimate rather than declarative. This is the watch you notice close up, not across a room. The thickness complaint, some find 11.6mm, slightly substantial for a dress category, is real but narrow. Most of that height is the box-shaped sapphire crystal. On the wrist, the lug geometry pulls it close, and it disappears. There is something worth saying about what Grand Seiko chose not to include here. No date means no date wheel, no date corrector, no cyclops lens, no asymmetric dial disruption. No power reserve means no indicator cluttering the lower half. No complications at all means the Zaratsu polishing has nowhere to compete with. The casework and the dial work are simply what you look at. Every design decision that was removed made the remaining ones more visible. That's not simplicity as an afterthought. It's simplicity as the entire argument. In a category where most dress watches are either too simple to justify the price or too complicated to look clean, the SBGW231 found the precise middle of the dial and stayed there. SBGW231 is a dress watch with nothing to prove and everything to show. What's next? Answered a question nobody thought a Swiss pilot watch could. 6. The IWC Mark XX. The Mark XX had a loyal following and a legitimate problem. The Salida-based movement inside it carried a 2-hour power reserve. For a pilot's watch, which is built on the idea of reliability in demanding conditions, of setting and forgetting for days at a time, 42 hours is short. Leave it off the wrist Friday night, pick it up Monday morning and you'll find it dead. Then you use to reset. For a watch in this category at this price, that was a genuine functional shortcoming. The Mark XX resolved it without theatrics. The caliber 32111 inside carries 120 hours of power reserve. You can take the watch off Thursday evening, and it will still be running Tuesday morning. The movement architecture is shared across the Richemont group. This is the same base caliber runs in Baume and Mercier's Baumatic and Panerais P900, which means it's been extensively tested and refined across multiple brands and markets. IWC calls it manufacture. The technically accurate description is Richemont Group caliber. Either way, it works, it keeps excellent time, and it gives you 5 days of autonomy in a 40mm package. The case also grew in a positive direction. Moving the date window slightly toward the edge improved the dial symmetry that the Mark 18 never quite nailed. The date felt adrift near the center, disrupting the balance that a clean pilot's dial demands. On the Mark XX, it sits better. Not perfect, but better. Water resistance upgraded to 100 meters. EaseX Change quick strap system makes strap swaps tool-free in seconds. The leather strap ships stiff. This is the one acknowledged complaint. But the EaseX Change means you're one motion away from a fabric NATO or a steel bracelet the moment it becomes inconvenient. 5 days of power reserve, a repositioned date, a clean dial. Reasonable price for IWC. In watchmaking terms, that's a comprehensive answer to a documented list of complaints. The Mark XX is what the Mark 18 always should have been, which is exactly what a Mark XX is supposed to be. 5 days of power reserve in a pilot watch? What's next turns the vintage revival category on its head, and it does it at a price that's genuinely hard to argue with. 5 Longines Legend Diver 39mm. The original Legend Diver reissue was 42 millimeters. The lug-to-lug distance on a 42 millimeters Legend Diver made the watch hang over the edge of average wrists like a diving board. It was beautiful. It was also unwearable for anyone with a wrist under about 7.5 inches. The community knew it. Longines knew it. The 39 millimeters version is a different watch. Same dial DNA, the inner rotating bezel, the clean, circular layout that references the original 60s skin diver design. The no-date face that removes the one element that made the vintage proportions feel crowded. But at 39 millimeters, the lug-to-lug comes in tight enough to actually sit on a wrist rather than span it. The watch hugs. The 42 millimeters floated inside. The Longines Caliber L, 888.5. A movement with silicon balance spring and 7 2-hour power reserve. The silicon spring eliminates magnetic interference and requires no lubrication. It simply runs, more reliably, over a longer service interval than conventional metal springs. For a watch positioned as a daily wear vintage revival, that service interval advantage is genuinely meaningful over a decade of ownership. The remaining complaint is loom. The Longines Legend Diver 39 millimeters uses historically accurate loom application, modest, correct for the reference, exactly what would have appeared on the original. If you want modern Seiko Prospex levels of glow-in-the-dark performance, this is not your watch. If you want a dive watch that looks right and wears right, it is. There is a reason the 39 millimeters Legend Diver has been cited consistently as the best skin diver on the current market. The case size correction alone would have made it noteworthy. The movement upgrade made it a recommendation. Think about what this watch actually is. It is a historically faithful recreation of a 1960s diver, running a silicon-sprung modern movement with 3 days of power reserve at $2,100. The vintage revival category is full of watches that get the aesthetics right and the mechanics wrong, or price themselves into a bracket that requires a different level of commitment. The Legend Diver 39 millimeters managed to get both right at a price that doesn't require a long conversation. Longines fixed the catalog entry that most needed fixing. This is what happens when a brand actually listens rather than just acknowledging feedback. A fixed classic. What's next isn't a revival at all. It's an original that finally got the size right for the people who had been waiting for it. 4 Zenith Chronomaster Original 38 millimeters. El Primero has a story worth understanding before we talk about this watch. In 1969, Zenith and 2 other manufacturers simultaneously released the world's first automatic chronograph movements. Zenith's movement, El Primero, beat at 36,000 vibrations per hour, 10 Hz. This was remarkable. Most chronograph movements of the era ran at 18,000 or 21,600. The higher frequency meant the chronograph could measure elapsed time to 1/10 of a second. Rolex, famously, bought El Primero movements from Zenith and regulated them down to 28,800 for use in the Daytona for years. The El Primero was good enough for Rolex to use and then modify for their own needs. The subsequent complaint about modern El Primero watches was size and legibility. The sub-dials on the 42 millimeters versions overlapped in ways that made reading the chronograph function more effort than it should be. The case was large, and the movement complexity felt buried under a dial that was doing too much. The Chronomaster Original 38 millimeters uses the new El Primero 3600 caliber. This evolution of the movement is tuned to allow the center chronograph hand to complete 1 revolution every 10 seconds rather than the traditional 60. The result: you can read elapsed time to 1/5 of a second visually, with a hand sweeping at a pace that is genuinely easy to follow. The 38 millimeters case matches the original 1969 A386 dimensions exactly. The sub-dials at this size don't compete, they coexist. The dial reads cleanly. One complaint remains, and it is legitimate. 50 meters of water resistance is the minimum acceptable for a modern daily watch, not a confident specification. You won't swim with it. You won't wear it in heavy rain without a small amount of concern. For a watch at this price, 50M is thin, but everything else adds up to a chronograph that finally justifies the El Primero heritage it carries. Zenith had been sitting on one of the most important movements in watchmaking history. At 38 millimeters, they started using it properly. Next, is a complication that shouldn't exist at its price, and the watch community is still processing it. Before we move on to the next part, let me tell you this. Most people don't realize this, but buying a watch the wrong way can cost you thousands, and you won't even notice it until it's too late. You walk into a store or browse online, and everything looks the same, but behind the scenes, there's a system. Prices aren't always fair, availability is controlled, and one bad decision can leave you overpaying for something that doesn't even hold its value. That's why I created a complete free insider guide to buying watches. Inside, you'll find the best watches to buy, the watches to avoid, and how to choose a watch that actually fits your style and budget long term. The goal is simple. I'll help you stop guessing and start buying smart. You'll find the free guide in the pinned comment and description. Now, let's move on to the next part. 3 Christopher Ward C. 1 Bel Canto. The complaint about chiming complications has always been the same. They cost the same as a house. A minute repeater, a watch that chimes the time on demand, requires hundreds of parts, hand-fitted by specialists, calibrated to sound as well as to function. Entry-level options from established Swiss makers start around $40,000. Credible ones start higher. This has been the case for generations. The assumption was that acoustic complications lived behind a price wall that almost nobody could access. Christopher Ward is a British brand that built its reputation on directness. The brand built a name from selling to consumers without the dealer markup layer, being transparent about movement sourcing, pricing based on component cost rather than heritage tax. The Bel Canto is their statement piece. It uses a sonnerie au passage, a passing strike mechanism that chimes on the quarter hour without any input from the wearer. Not a repeater, which chimes on demand, but a striking watch that marks time audibly as it passes. This is a different and in some ways more demanding complication, because it must operate reliably on its own, every 15 minutes, all day, every day. Christopher Ward built this on a Sellita base with a proprietary chiming module. The result is a watch that sounds the quarter hours with a clarity that reviewers have described as genuinely musical. The visual language is polarizing. The Bel Canto looks like a laboratory instrument crossed with a clock face. The large, open architecture of the chiming module is visible. The bridges are exposed. The geometry is not for the conservative buyer. This is not a complaint, exactly. It's a statement. The watch announces what it is without apology. At under $5,000 for a chiming complication from a credible manufacturer, the value argument is almost irrefutable. The question isn't whether the Bel Canto is worth it. The question is whether you are the person it's designed for. Christopher Ward built the complication the other 50 brands decided wasn't their problem. Some people are still annoyed about it. What's next is the most technically complete diver on this list, and the one that closed the most long-running debate in its category. Tudor Pelagos 39. The argument about Tudor dive watches has been running for years. The original Pelagos was the serious option. Grade 2 titanium, 500-meter water resistance, helium escape valve, the spring-loaded clasp that became a signature, proper saturation diving credentials. But at 42 millimeters and 15 millimeters thick, it wore like a hockey puck on anything under a 7.5-inch wrist. People loved it on paper. They struggled with it in practice. The Black Bay 58 was the accessible option. 39 millimeters, beautiful, wearable, vintage-inspired, one of the best value propositions in mechanical watchmaking. One complaint followed it everywhere: no modern clasp. The Black Bay's clasp was a pin buckle or a simple folding type. For a sports watch at its price, buyers expected more. The Pelagos 39 is, without overstatement, the synthesis of everything both watches needed to be. Grade 2 titanium case at 39 millimeters and 11.8 millimeters thick. At that thickness, it is the slimmest Pelagos ever made, thinner than the Black Bay 58 by a fraction. You put it on, and it is simply not there. Titanium, at this size and thickness, has a wearing quality that steel cannot replicate. The watch doesn't feel absent in a cheap way. It feels present in a calm way. The T-Fit clasp provides 8 millimeters of on-the-fly adjustment across 5 positions, no tool required. Wrist swells in the heat, contracts in the cold. The bracelet follows you. A dive extension is included. A rubber strap with wetsuit extension is in the box. Tudor didn't give you one option and call it done. The manufacturer Caliber MT5400 is COSC certified, adjusted to better than chronometer spec after casing, running -2 to +4 seconds per day in real-world testing. 70-hour power reserve, silicon balanced spring for magnetic resistance without an iron cage, 200-meter water resistance. The one genuine complaint is that there's no date. For the dive watch community, this split into two camps instantly. Date is functional on a saturation dive. Day tracking matters when you're at depth for extended periods. Without a helium valve, the Pelagos 39 is a recreational diver's watch, not a saturation diver's watch. For that use case, no date is clean. The argument is valid from both sides. But from any reasonable daily wear standpoint, titanium, COSC certified, T-fit clasp, 70-hour reserve, 200-meter, at $4,400. The room went quiet. The Pelagos 39 didn't split the difference between two good watches. It improved on both of them. Tudor solved years of debate in one watch. Number one did something different. It built a watch in a category where the complaint wasn't about the watch. It was about what the watch couldn't do. One Citizen, the Citizen AQ4020. The Grand Seiko 9F quartz is the benchmark for high-end quartz accuracy, 10 seconds per year. 50-year service interval, 0 error instant correction on the second hand. It is a genuine watchmaking achievement and remains the reference point for what a quartz movement can be. The complaint about this watch is that the 9F has no solar charging, no perpetual calendar, no automatic time correction. You set it manually. You change the date manually at month end. You manage it like a fine mechanical watch, just with better accuracy. For most owners, this is fine. For the buyer who wants the precision without the administration, it was a gap. The Citizen AQ4020 fills that gap completely. EcoDrive solar charging from any light source. No battery replacement, ever. Accuracy of ±5 seconds per year. Perpetual calendar that accounts for leap years automatically through 2100. Radio-controlled multi-band time synchronization in 6 countries, meaning the watch sets itself when it receives an atomic time signal. You never adjust the date at month end. You never reset after a long-haul flight. You never think about the battery. The washi paper dial is the detail that stops people mid-conversation. Washi is traditional Japanese paper, incorporated into the dial construction as a material rather than a design reference. The texture is subtle and tactile. Under different light, it reads differently, sometimes matte, sometimes with a faint shimmer along the grain. It is the kind of dial that gets described in close inspection terms. You lean in, and there is more there than you expected. The finishing on the case meets standards that other manufacturers at this price point don't reach. Grand Seiko collectors who handle the AQ4020 typically note that the casework is competitive with significantly more expensive Japanese watches. Citizen built this watch under their premium sub-brand for buyers who know what they're looking at. It rewards that knowledge. The remaining complaint is brand perception. Citizen still reads as affordable mass market to buyers who haven't encountered the Citizen line. There is genuine cognitive dissonance in spending $3,000 on a watch that says Citizen on the dial, not because the watch doesn't justify it, but because the association takes adjustment. This is Citizen's problem to solve through continued positioning, and they're solving it slowly. The watch itself has no apology to make. Solar-powered, perpetual calendar, 5-second annual accuracy, radio-corrected, washi dial, $3,000. The 9F quartz answered the question of what a quartz movement could be. The AQ4020 answered the question of what you'd want it to do while you're living your life. 10 watches, 10 different categories, 10 different problems that finally got real answers. What links all of them isn't price. They range from $600 to nearly $9,000. 5 countries, 5 watchmaking traditions. It isn't even the category of watch, because a Bauhaus dress piece and a German submarine steel diver share essentially nothing in their design language. What they share is specificity. Every complaint that was leveled at each watch's predecessor was a real complaint. Too big, too short on reserve, too complicated looking when it should be simple. too hard to scratch off in daily use. Each of these watches looked at those complaints and answered them directly. That's rarer than it should be. Most watches are iterated from models that already sell. The motivation is commercial, not corrective. A watch that actually repairs its predecessor's shortcomings requires the brand to acknowledge there were shortcomings, which is a harder thing to do in public than it sounds. These 10 did it. The honest test for any watch on this list: find the predecessor, read the complaints, then look at the current model. In each case, the complaints became the design brief. That discipline is what separates watches that get better from watches that just get updated. That's why these 10 are worth your time. Not because they're flawless, because they're honest.